I have the privilege of traveling around the world and walking with pastors, various nations all over America and Canada, and especially over the course of COVID and all that ravaged. I was trying to talk and listen to what pastors were going through, and hopefully on the other side of COVID, listening to what pastors were finding. And I think you all have witnessed yourself, and you've seen numbers, but I know just coming out of COVID, the average number, the kind of commonly accepted number was that across the board in America, on the other side of COVID, churches were running about 30% on average less than what they were running before COVID. Some much worse, some not as bad. Every time I'm going to speak in a church next week, and they were telling me, they said, well, before COVID, we were running 1,500 on Sundays. We're at about 1,000 right now, they would say. And every church I go to lately tells me what they were doing before COVID, and now, we're hoping to get back there. But many pastors and church leaders were bewildered at what happened to their church. Because it was as if COVID just came and took the church and just violently shook it. And then you looked at the debris and the rubble and the ruin, the people that were gone, and many church leaders said, what happened to my church? Where did those people go? Why aren't they still here? And my son is a church planter in Canada. It hadn't been even meeting for a full year yet when COVID struck, and the Canadian government just said you cannot meet for over a year. They didn't meet. And when you're not even a year-old meeting as a church, you don't have a lot of long-time members that are committed to the church. And over the silliest things, people would leave. The same week, my son had people leave because he wasn't being tough enough. He was letting unvaccinated people come in the building. And the same week, he had other people leaving because he was being too tough, asking people to wear masks for all the people that were afraid of the unvaccinated people. He said, the same week, I've got people leaving because I'm too tough or I'm not tough enough. He said, I can't make any more decisions because every decision I make costs me more members. Were you there? Did you experience that? And then he said, Dad, I think the lowest point for my son, he said, Dad, that family that just left, he said, I can't tell you how many times we fed them around our dinner table. I took both of their teenage kids out every birthday, took them to ice cream, one-on-one time with their pastor. I stood on the sidelines and cheered on their soccer teams when their kids were playing. And because I let unvaccinated people come to church wearing masks, that family just said, we're leaving. We don't trust a pastor like you. And he just said, I thought I knew. I was ready to make those people deacons, leaders in the church. And then they left over that. We could probably all tell some stories of what we've been through. And so as I've talked to pastors and I've said, what are you taking from this? What are you learning from this? The number one thing that I'm hearing, you might have heard there's other things I'm hearing, but the number one thing I've heard is that they said, we realize we failed to make them disciples. We developed church attenders. We did not develop disciples. And I have pastors saying, had they been a full-fledged follower and disciple of Jesus, I believe they'd still be here. But they did not have their eyes on where Jesus wanted. Isn't it interesting? I said to one person that said they left the church over a mask policy. I said, well, who brought you to the church? Why? We felt God brought us to the church. So I said, so God brought you to the church and a mask took you out? That's all it took? A mask? Almighty God told you that's where you belong, and a mask took you out, canceled everything God had done? Folks, I want to look with you for a few moments because as I've heard that, I've gone back to say, well, what is it we should be doing as churches and as church leaders? And whether you're trying to revitalize a church, whether you're trying to take your church from where it is to where it needs to be, whether you're trying to start a church, I think it's the very same thing. And do you remember what Jesus said at the very end of Matthew 28? And he gets down there and he says, what? Go therefore and what? The very last thing he tells his disciples, his followers, before he ascends to heaven. What? Go therefore and what? make disciples. He doesn't say, go therefore and rent the largest arenas everywhere you can find and try to have a citywide crusade. What does he say? Make disciples. One disciple, and you don't make disciples in arenas. You do it one at a time, don't you? And you know what's interesting? I never really noticed this before. What's the last thing, that beautiful promise he makes right at the end of the Gospel of Matthew? And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, why did he just say that? He just finished saying, go make disciples. And lo, I will be with you always. See, we take out the first part, right? And we just love to claim the promise, God's always with us. Well, why did he? Now, he is always with us if you've got the Spirit of God. But why did he tell you he was always with you? Because he assumed you'd be going and making disciples. Why do you need him to be with you? Because you need the power to make disciples. But we've cut that part out, and we want to selfishly sit at home or go to our church and never make a disciple, but just take comfort in the fact that no matter what happens to us, he's always with us. What was the context of his presence in your life was to empower you to make disciples. And so I want you to look in Mark chapter 1, and we know this passage so well that I want to just take a few minutes, and I know I'm going to step on some toes, and I apologize. If it upsets you, talk to Mark about it. But read with me for just a moment. Mark 1, in verses 16 and following, it says, as he passed alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, Simon's brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Follow me, Jesus told them, and I will make you fish for people. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat, putting their nets in order. Immediately he called them and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. Now you have preached this, you've taught this, you studied this, you may have memorized this. You know it well. But I have found sometimes in the church, especially churches that need to be revitalized, that we sometimes miss what we think we know. We know Scripture so well that we don't see what it's actually saying anymore. And I want you to, so what I want to do for a moment, and I tell you what, I could take 3 days and just unpack the truths I'm going to share with you in 30 minutes. So just trust me, if I had time, I would back everything up with plentiful argumentation here, okay? But I'm just going to toss some stuff out to you and invite you just to do your own search, do your own consideration. But what I want you to see for a moment is not necessarily what Jesus asked these disciples to do, but what he does not ask them to do. What does he not invite them to do? And I think when you see what he has not invited them to do, it will make it clear what we should be doing. And by the way, this of course is the beginning in Mark's gospel. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of the journey of the disciples following Jesus. He's calling his first ones the big four, the 3 inner circle disciples. They're all getting invited here. And what I have found is how you begin something has an enormous impact on how you end something. And that's why I think it's important that when you begin discipling someone, you understand how did Jesus begin the process. Don't try to add a bunch of stuff to what Jesus didn't do. Just say, so what did Jesus invite these people to do? Let me just throw a couple out there. And again, like I said, any one of these we could take an hour or two to unpack. I'm going to skim very quickly. But the first thing that Jesus does not invite them to do is to believe in him. He does not ask for a decision, does he? He does not come to Andrew and Peter and say, if you'd like to have me come into your life so you can go to heaven when you die, would you raise your hand? Would you come forward for a moment and I'll pray with you and you can decide your eternal destiny? He doesn't do that, right? He doesn't ask them to believe in him. He asks them to follow him. He says, get out of the boat and follow me. Now, I fear that Southern Baptists, in our zeal to evangelize, have been pursuing decisions and not disciples.
As long as and I can't tell you how many people have said, that person hasn't been in church in years, and they live like the devil, and they mock the very thought of doing what Jesus says. But when they were 7, they prayed and made a decision. And I can only hope that despite the fact they live like the devil today, that decision will get them into heaven one day. Folks, our problem is we've made decisions so easy, and discipleship appears so hard. But Jesus did not come and ask for decision. He said, come follow me. Get out of your boat, start following me. And the other thing I've noticed about decision making is that we've asked, now our society, it's all about what you believe, right? It's like, well, I have people say, well, I'm a Christian. I believe in God. I just can't believe that a loving God would send anybody to hell, so I don't believe that. And I just don't believe that a loving God would prevent two people who love each other from being married to one another, so I don't believe that. You see, when it's all about what you believe, you're still in the driver's seat. If you don't like something, you just don't believe it. But folks, Jesus doesn't say believe what you want. Don't believe or believe what I'm saying. He says you're not in control. This isn't about what you believe. It's about whether you're going to follow me or not. And when they got out of their boat, they didn't even know where they're going to lay their heads that night. They didn't know how they're going to eat. They weren't in control. Of course, you know what Jesus said. He said, or James said, he said, the demons believe in me. In fact, they're probably more Orthodox believers than a lot of Christians because they saw the empty tomb. They watched Jesus die on the cross. They saw him resurrected from the dead. And they know what he's going to do to them one day. And they tremble as a result. Folks, let me tell you something. Do you tremble in God's presence? Jeremiah 5, verse 22, God said, do you not fear me, says the Lord? Will you not tremble at my presence? If you don't tremble in the presence of holy God, you're not even as believing as the demons are. They at least shudder at the thought of God. But our belief system is so where we're in the driver's seat that we have this comfortable Jesus that we believe in, and it doesn't even cause us to tremble. He doesn't ask them to believe. Now, they will believe, won't they? But why will they believe? Because they've been with him. They've seen him. When you see him calm a storm with a word, when you see him raise a man dead 4 days and he comes out of the tomb, you get to the point where you believe, and it's not because of just some quick gospel presentation. It's because you've seen the reality. You've heard Jesus speak truth to you, and now you believe. Well, secondly, he also, now we're going to get a little sensitive here for a moment, okay? He doesn't ask them to study about him or develop a theology about him. He doesn't just climb into the boat and say, let's have a Bible study together, right? He doesn't say, I want you just to kind of work out your theology of what you believe about me. He says you will have now theology is important. All of these are important. But their theology is going to be based on what they've learned from Jesus, what they've watched him do, what they've heard him teach. It's not going to be because they sat in an ivory tower somewhere in a fishing boat and came up with a pristine, perfect theology. And I look, what I realize is that if Bible studies could make the church a vibrant, powerful Christians, I tell you what, there'd be revival right now. There are more Bible studies going on right now in America than there's ever been. And you can get them online. You can get them with Zoom. There's Bible studies, good Lord. Our problem is God's people aren't practicing what they already know. And we keep learning more things that we're not going to practice. It's not a matter of studying the Bible. Now, again, you hear me, right? If you're a disciple, you will study the Bible, right? I minored in theology. I like theology. I'm not saying theology is a bad thing. What I'm saying is I know people, this is what happens. If you focus on just theology, it's all about just build this perfect theology. You know what theology tends to do? It tends to lead to pride. Because you realize your theology is better than their theology. Your theology is more orthodox than their theology. And you start, and you focus on the parts of theology, by the way, that you like, that suits your personal tastes. And you kind of skip the parts of theology that are a little awkward, right? We kind of can customize and personalize our theology so it's just what we like. And I could illustrate that in many ways. But I'll tell you what, when you get out of your boat and start following Jesus, that's a humbling thing. And when you're, I've been a Baptist all my life. I intend to die a Baptist. I've got Baptist theology through my veins. I believe in being Baptist. I'm happy Southern Baptist. Happened all my life. But I want to tell you something. I believe that there's going to be some non-Baptists who get to heaven. And they may not, their theology may have been off a little bit. I think they still know what it takes to be born again, and they're coming to heaven just with me. But I'll tell you what, I see too many of God's people now. They take delight in criticizing everybody else's theology, but they don't, isn't it interesting? They'll claim, I've got the doctrines of Christ. The problem is they don't have the character of Christ. Have you noticed people like that? That will literally assassinate someone's character. They'll troll them on social media, all because they're not as orthodox as they are. Something's wrong, is it? If you're so obsessed with your theology that you become a Pharisee and you sit and you judge everybody else. But when you're following Jesus, you'll develop a theology, but it's going to be a Christ-like theology. And I'll tell you, I was experiencing God in our ministry. We've been very privileged. I get to go into a lot of it's amazing how many denominations experiencing God has gotten into. But you know why it's done that? Because it's just about focusing on Jesus. And there's a lot of different denominations who like to do that. And about 2 years ago, my son and I were invited to Hilton Head, South Carolina. There's an Experiencing God week, the whole weekend. All over Hilton Head and the surrounding area, Christians wanted to gather and hear me and my son talk about how to experience God. Do you know who hosted the meeting? An evangelical Anglican church. It's in an Anglican church. And do you know who was jointly sponsoring it? The Presbyterian Church in Hilton Head and First Baptist Church. The Baptist guy and the Presbyterian guy had just come to their churches. They were all there. And I'm in an Anglican church. I introduced the Presbyterian pastor to the Baptist pastor. And I'm walking around, and there's several tables over here, and I go over just to meet them. And they say, we're all from the Methodist church. Now, I don't agree with all the Methodist, Presbyterian, Anglican theology, okay? Can I tell you that? But I'll tell you what, when you step in line and you start following Jesus, you may meet some really interesting people following along with you. And it doesn't mean, now I'm not telling you to compromise your theology. I'm not telling you that we're all alike. No, we've got distinctives. But can I tell you, what Jesus first did was not to say, let's get all your belief system perfect and pure before you ever get out of the boat. He said, get out of the boat, follow me, and I'll teach you truth. And if you listen and pay attention, you'll know the truth. But you remember when the disciples came to Jesus and said, we saw someone casting out demons, but he's not in our tribe. He's not in our denomination, basically. And so we tried to hinder him. Remember what Jesus said? Well, if they're not against us, they're for us. So just leave them alone. Leave them alone. Just focus on you following Jesus with all your heart. I think we tend to forget who the enemy is. People following Jesus are not the enemy, regardless of what denominational label they may be carrying. They're not the enemy. We've got enough enemies without picking the wrong people to be our enemy. And so he doesn't say, just study about me, just develop theology about me. He says, follow me. Can I tell you, there's some people pretty high in their theology. I think they need to put their theology books aside a little bit and just go get out of their boat and follow Jesus for a while. It would do wonders for their theology. Third thing, now I'm going to get into hot water because we've had excellent worship here, have we not? But he doesn't ask Peter and Andrew to worship him. He says, get out of the boat and follow me. Now, worship is, I think, perhaps the most important thing we'll do in our life, in our existence ever. We're created to worship, right? But he doesn't say, hey, Peter, Andrew, I'm the Son of God. Get on your knees. Start worshiping. Start singing. Start praising. What does he do? He says, follow me. But I'll tell you what, when Peter sees Jesus calm the storm with a word, what's Peter say? Who is this man? Who are you? Well, I tell you what, I could have sung a song about you back in the fishing boat, but since I've been following you, I've seen things that blow me away. I could never have imagined. And based on what I've seen with my own eyes, I want to get on my knees and worship you with all my heart. He does now. Following Jesus will lead to worship. There's no doubt about it. But I'll just tell you, the problem you know what? Do you know the typical? Now, there's no denomination more evangelistic than Southern Baptist, and one of the reasons I love being Southern Baptist. But can I tell you the number one way that Southern Baptists typically evangelize? We invite someone to come to church. You invite your neighbor to come to church. And then you hope the pastor will evangelize. So what we're doing is we're saying, come worship with us. The problem is they're not followers of Jesus yet. We're asking non-followers to worship with us, which is a difficult thing for them to do. In fact, it's impossible for them to do that. But we want to, if you just get in there and worship with us, that'll be great. But what happened is, so we've invited people to be church attenders, with the hope that as you're attending church, you'll experience the reality of God and you'll get saved. But as soon as COVID hit, a whole bunch of those church attenders stopped attending church because they weren't followers. And it didn't take very much for them just to exit out. And what I found is, this is what we've done. We've thought if we can just have an awesome worship experience, and we get people in here, and the worship team is great, and the lighting is great, sermons are riveting, that we'll just grow this church. And that's really what the church growth movement did for a number of decades. It just taught you how to fill the building up. And you just had to have a new gimmick and a new approach, a new marketing campaign. You had to always stay ahead of the church down the street that's also doing the same thing, trying to get people in their building. And so you worked really hard to get people in the building. But a lot of those people were not Jesus followers. They just liked the good show. They liked the music. They came in, they sat at the back, and they just observed the whole service. And then when COVID hit and they started having to live stream, guess what they discovered? You can observe the whole service sitting in your pajamas and your couch, eating a sandwich. And you don't even have to get dressed. I mean, if you're going to observe it anyway, why go to church? Why go to the trouble? You cut it out anytime you want. If they're kind of meddling in that sermon, just switch over to a different live stream and observe them for a while. Folks, I tell you, we trained people to come in and observe what was going on. We didn't teach them how to follow Jesus. My son Mike, that's a church planner, as he was reflecting on this, he said, Dad, I just got to be honest with you. He said, I was measuring all the wrong things. He said, if the attendance was up, I was up. I felt good about myself. Now, it might have been filled with people, carnal as the day is long, who have no desire to follow Jesus. They just heard there's a good speaker in my church. And but I'm feeling good about myself because the attendance is up. And if it was down, I felt terrible. My whole self-worth was on the blocks. And he said, and so he said last year in 2022, he said, so I've decided I'm going to measure different. I refuse simply to base my effectiveness as a minister by how well I'm filling up a building. I'm going to measure myself by, am I making disciples? And by the way, folks, when I ask pastors, are you making disciples? Don't assume because you're preaching on Sunday that qualifies as making a disciple. There's a whole lot more involved in making a disciple. We think that we're off the hook because we preach on Sunday. That's not making a disciple. Until they're following Jesus, they're not a disciple. In fact, until they're making other disciples who follow Jesus, they are not a full-fledged disciple yet. And if I were to walk around this room and just ask every one of you one-on-one, so who are you discipling right now? If you can't name anyone you're discipling, you are blatantly disobeying the very last commandment Jesus gave in the Gospel of Matthew. We were commanded to make disciples. And disciples are people who do what? Who do everything that Jesus commanded. And the last thing he commanded was to make disciples. So if you're going to teach them to do everything, then you're going to have to teach them to make disciples. So my son Mike last year, he said, Dad, so what we're doing is He said, we're going to put everybody in our church into a small group, and they're going to a discipleship group, and we're going to urge them just to grow in following Jesus together. And so he turned to his core group and he said, that's what I want you to do. I want everybody here to be in a small, and not a group of 12. He said, all the introverts will just hide behind in a group of 12. He said, I want it so small that even the introverts have to speak up now and then and get involved. And so he said 4 to 6 people. And so his core group, they accepted that. They said, we'll do that. And then they started coming to him. They said, well, Mike, who's going to be in my group? And Mike said, well, you make disciples. Like, you go get people. Invite your neighbor to come into your group. Invite the guy down the hall in your apartment building. Invite someone at work. Maybe have a discipleship group in your work time over the lunch hour. Oh, okay. I thought you were going to give us people, and you're going to give me a list. No, that's up to you. You're to make disciples. And they came back and said, Mike, so what's the curriculum? What are we going to be following? And Mike said, well, do you have a Bible? Use that. Well, I thought you were going to give us an outline or something to follow. Well, I can tell you some studies. You could do experiencing God, lots of things, but it's up to you. You figure out what those people need in their discipleship. You're the discipler, not me. And then they came back and said, well, so now where are we meeting to do this? Is this going to be at a church building somewhere? He said, you figured, you have a house. Go to a coffee shop. And Mike came to me later. He said, Dad, these are the most dedicated members in my entire church, and they haven't a clue how to make a disciple. If the pastor's not holding their hand and telling them everything to do, they are clueless, don't even know how to get to first base on making a disciple. And he said, Dad, that's my fault. I'm supposed to be equipping the saints, and none of my saints know how to make a disciple. He said, that's my fault. And so he said, Dad, what was I doing? I just thought if I preached good enough sermons, the building would fill up. But we don't have disciples. He said, I've got to change how I lead my people. I've got to start measuring different things. Folks, see, you don't have to be a megachurch to make a disciple, right? You just have to be one person taking one. Do you want a young people's group? Start discipling some teenagers. You want a college group? Find a college student that will let you disciple them. You want to get more business people in your church? Start discipling business people. And watch when they start discipling some of their own. And it begins to multiply. Jesus intended to start a worldwide movement, one disciple at a time. It's a powerful thing. And Jesus hasn't changed the game plan in 2,000 years. We have, but he hasn't. Let me just mention 2 others. I won't go into it. But Jesus also doesn't tell the disciples to embrace the mission. He doesn't give them the Great Commission in day 1. Can you imagine if Jesus stood beside Peter's boat and said, I'm going to give you a world-changing mission to go into all the world to make disciples? Peter would have probably jumped out of his boat and started running off to do it, right? He wasn't ready to do that. Remember, even in Acts, Jesus is about to go. He said, now don't go anywhere. You don't have the Holy Spirit yet. I think one of the biggest problems with Southern Baptists is we have a great evangelistic, mission-minded mission. We just keep asking non-Jesus followers to carry it out. Have you heard of a Southern Baptist president who has not said evangelism and baptisms is the priority of the SBC? And then what happens? We have less baptisms the next year. What's going on? That's our mission, right? Well, we keep asking people who don't know how to follow Jesus to invite other people to come follow Jesus. We've got to get them Jesus followers, and they will go and make other disciples. But we have a mission that doesn't necessarily, Rick Warren wrote, of course, a popular book, Purpose-Driven Church. And I want to be nitpicky, but I want to say that's our problem. We need to be a Christ-driven church, not a purpose. See, a purpose is an idol. You don't have to go to Jesus and follow him. Just find your purpose and then run out there and start fulfilling it. Do you see the difference between chasing after a purpose, a value, a bedrock core principle, and just being a follower of Jesus who leads you to your workplace and to your neighbor and to that person from a different ethnic group that you're kind of scared of, and he says, come with me. We're going to get to know that person. Again, I'm not saying you don't develop a plan, But your plan ought to be to go wherever Jesus leads you. Well, there's one more. I'll just, for time's sake, I won't go there. But let me just say this. I talked about my dad being called into to leave a good church that was growing. This church had just voted to give my dad a big increase in pay. They voted to send him to Israel. They voted to pay and help him get his doctor's degree. They voted to give him a big book allowance. They voted to renovate his office. I mean, they wanted my dad to stay there and die there in retirement. And then my dad says, I can't thank you enough for all you've done for me, but I feel like Jesus is leading me to go to Canada to a church of 10 people. You got to be crazy. They said, like, think about your kids. They'll never graduate from college. You won't be able to pay to. He said, take that up with Jesus. He just said, come follow me, and he's going to Canada. Yeah, but like you're so talented, you could have so much more impact here in Los Angeles. Yeah, that makes sense to me. But Jesus said, follow me to Canada. I know it sounds crazy. Tell Jesus to not lead me to Canada, and I won't go. But that's where he's leading me. And so he got to Canada. Moved there at the end of April, and my mom is pregnant. She's going to have our sister, their fifth child, in December. She gives birth to my sister, and my mom starts hemorrhaging. My mom starts having all kinds of complications. And my dad one night gets called down to the hospital, and he's driven over 1,700 miles from Los Angeles to Saskatoon to help out a church of 10 people. And this night he's going to find out if he's a widower the next morning. And not one church person drove 2 miles to sit with him that night. He's sitting alone in a waiting room. And into the night, the surgeon walks out into the waiting area. He says, is there a Mr. Blackaby here? My dad raises his hand. The surgeon comes over, obviously distracted in a hurry. He says, Mr. Blackaby, we can't stop your wife's bleeding. We've done everything that we can do. There's nothing more to do. If her bleeding doesn't stop, she won't live through tomorrow. And he goes racing back into the surgery room. And I asked my dad about that. I mean, you could say, where are these people I came and laid my life down for? Dragged my 4 kids, my 5th one on the way, my wife. And where's the people who appreciate me, who want to stand with me and thank me and help me? He's there alone, waiting to find out. And I asked my dad later, what was going through your mind that night? Did you think you made a huge mistake? Should you have stayed where people loved you and appreciated you, were paying you? He said, Richard, I just can't explain it, except that all of a sudden it just felt like that whole waiting area was just filled with a thick presence of a loving God. And I've never felt Jesus so close to me. And he said, Richard, it was in that moment, it was as if Jesus just said, I told you I would never leave you or forsake you. And I'm here with you. And it will be okay. Just you have followed me. And I'll never forsake someone who gets out of their boat and follows me to a hard place. And early in the morning, that surgeon came over to my dad, shaking his head. He said, I can't explain it, but your wife's bleeding just stopped. He said, we didn't do a thing. I don't know how it happened. My dad said, I know how it happened. God told me it would happen. And the surgeon looked at my dad and said, well, he's the only one who knew. And I'll tell you what, God began to birth an amazing ministry there. And now I'm not saying it wasn't hard. I'm not saying that there wasn't times where everything was shaken. But God's presence was always real. Now, don't hear me, don't go away and say, Richard doesn't believe in worship or theology or Bible study. I'm not saying that, folks. But I'm telling you, when your world gets shaken, people start leaving, when they start criticizing you, I'm telling you, you may have the most pristine theology in the world. But you're going to have to know that right ahead of you is Jesus, and you've been following him the whole time. And see, when you follow him, you are where he is, and he is where you are. And that may be the only thing that keeps you in place and gives you hope for the future. Well, I'm going to take just a moment to pray with you. And I want to challenge you in this year of 2023. Are you making church attenders? Are you making people that sign on to the same creed that you do? Or are you making people that are Jesus followers just like you? And I don't know a better way to help people follow Jesus than for me to show them myself what it looks like. come with me. I'm following Jesus. And you can follow him too. And I'll tell you what, when you've got people following Jesus anywhere he goes, there's nowhere they won't go with him. And it doesn't matter, COVID could come 10 times as bad as what came the last time. And those Jesus followers will still be in tow, going wherever Jesus leads them. Lord, thank you for these wonderful people that have come and are seeking to hear from you. And Lord, they work hard, and they've been faithful. But God, I do pray that you would also just help us not to be distracted by the many good things that we could do, that we neglect the primary thing. You called us to make disciples. God, not to fill pews up with listeners, not to preach in such a way that people want to thank us for the wonderful sermon, but Lord, to guide people so that they will follow Jesus to the ends of the earth. Help us, Lord, to make reproducing followers of Jesus, disciples who make disciples. Help that to be our measuring stick for our success. Lord, help us to make that the driving force and focus of our church ministry. And I pray that in the days to come, Lord, there will be a great new host of Jesus following disciples rising up in the churches and following you to the ends of the earth, wherever you would lead. And I would pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.